She stepped off that stagecoach and the whole town stopped breathing. He looked her dead in the eyes and told her to go back where she came from. She picked up her bag, walked right past him, and climbed onto his wagon anyway. Within 48 hours, she had uncovered a secret that powerful men had buried for 20 years, and those men would do anything to put it back in the ground. This is the story of a woman nobody wanted, a ranch that was dying, and a valley full of lies that were about to catch fire. If this story pulls you in, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. Now settle in, because this one goes deep. The morning Evelyn Cross arrived in Harlan Creek, Montana, the sky was the color of an old bruise, purple and yellow, and threatening something worse before noon. It was the kind of morning that made sensible people stay indoors. Gideon Mercer was not a sensible man. He was a stubborn one, which was a different thing entirely, and he stood at the edge of the stagecoach platform with his hat pulled low and his jaw set like a man preparing to receive bad news he'd already decided to ignore. He'd been standing there for 20 minutes. The stage was late, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the way his stomach had been knotting itself since before dawn, the way he'd stared at the ceiling of his bedroom at 4 a.m, listening to the wind scrape across the roof and thinking, this is either the best decision I've ever made or the worst one, and I won't know which until it's too late to do anything about it. The letter from the matrimonial agency in Richmond had been brief and professional. It had described Miss Evelyn Cross as a woman of practical sensibility and capable disposition, which was exactly what Gideon had requested. He hadn't wanted beauty. He hadn't wanted charm. He certainly hadn't wanted anything that would make him feel anything beyond the mild convenience of having another pair of hands to help run a ranch that was slowly trying to kill him. He'd wanted someone quiet, someone useful, someone who would understand from the very beginning that this was a business arrangement, nothing more. What he got was Evelyn Cross. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in a cloud of dust and bad temperament, and the door swung open with a creak that sounded like a complaint, and she stepped down onto the platform and Gideon felt the bottom fall out of his chest. She was not what he'd pictured. He hadn't pictured much, deliberately, but whatever vague, purposefully unremarkable image he'd built in his mind during the 3 weeks since he'd mailed that letter, something plain, something forgettable, something that wouldn't cause him trouble, none of it was her. She was tall for a woman, with a straight back and dark hair coiled neatly at the nape of her neck. Her traveling dress was navy blue and practical, not fashionable, and it was dusty from 2 days of rough road. She wore no jewelry except a small watch pinned to her lapel. She carried her own bag, a worn leather satchel that looked like it had been everywhere, and she set it down on the platform with the quiet efficiency of someone who was already thinking about the next thing she had to do. She looked around the street. Her eyes were dark brown, sharp in the way that some people's eyes are sharp when they've spent a long time paying attention to things other people miss. Then those eyes found Gideon, and she walked straight toward him. The handful of townspeople who had materialized on the platform and the street nearby, because news traveled fast in Harlan Creek, and the story of the rancher who'd ordered himself a mail-order bride was the most interesting thing that had happened since the Pearson barn fire. They all watched. Gideon was aware of them watching. He was aware of Walt Gruber leaning against the post outside the general store, grinning like this was the finest entertainment he'd seen in years. He was aware of Ida Crane, the postmaster's wife, standing with her arms folded and her expression already arranging itself into the particular shape it took when she was preparing a piece of gossip for later. None of that was what made Gideon's jaw go tight. What made his jaw go tight was the simple fact of Evelyn Cross walking toward him like she was completely unbothered by any of it, and knowing with absolute certainty, in some deep, inconvenient part of himself, that he had made a terrible mistake. Not because she was wrong, because she was too right. Because a woman like this, capable, composed, clearly intelligent, the kind of woman who didn't need anyone to carry her bag, a woman like this would not stay in a broken-down ranch with a man who had nothing left to offer and walls built high enough to block out the sky. She would look at his crumbling fence posts and his dried-up creek bed and the hole in the barn roof he'd been patching with the wrong materials for 3 seasons, and she would understand exactly what she'd walked into, and she would leave. And the leaving would be worse than if she'd never come. He'd been left before. He knew what it did to a person. So Gideon Mercer, who was not a cruel man but was sometimes a preemptive one, made a decision. Before she could take stock of the situation and reject it herself, he would reject it first. It would be kinder that way. Cleaner. He believed that, right up until the moment she stopped in front of him and said, quietly and without any ceremony at all, "Mr. Mercer, I'm Evelyn Cross." She held out her hand. Gideon looked at it. Then he looked at her face. Up close, she was even more composed than she'd appeared from a distance. There was something still about her, something watchful that reminded him of the way a hawk holds itself on a fence post. Not still, because there's nothing there, but still because it's saving itself for what matters. He did not take her hand. "Miss Cross," he said, "I owe you an apology." She waited. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said, "about what I required. I don't think this arrangement is going to work." Silence. Not from her. She didn't flinch, didn't pull her hand back, didn't change her expression. The silence came from the street, from the half-dozen people close enough to hear, from Walt Gruber, who had stopped grinning, from Ida Crane, whose mouth had come slightly open. Evelyn Cross looked at Gideon for a long moment. "You haven't asked me a single question," she said. "I don't need to." "That's interesting," she said, in a tone that suggested she did not find it interesting in the way he might like. "You've determined, in the approximately 30 seconds since I stepped off that coach, that I'm unsuitable for your ranch." "I didn't say unsuitable." "What did you say exactly?" She was not being aggressive. That was the thing that wrong-footed him. Her voice was perfectly level. "You said there was a misunderstanding about what you required, which suggests that I am not what you required. So, what were you requiring, Mr. Mercer?" He was aware distantly that Walt Gruber had forgotten to close his mouth. "Someone more practical," Gideon said. The words sounded stupider coming out than they had going in. "Someone suited to ranch conditions." "And what about me?" said Evelyn Cross. "Gives you the impression I'm not suited to ranch conditions." He didn't answer, because the honest answer, "Everything about you suggests you're too good for it," was not a thing he was willing to say. She watched him not answer. "I see," she said, and the two words carried about 15 different things in them, none of which were flustered or wounded. She reached down and picked up her leather satchel. "Which direction is your wagon?" Gideon blinked. "Miss Cross." "I assume you drove the wagon in from the ranch," she said. "I'd like to get started. I've been sitting in that stage for 2 days, and I'd rather be doing something useful than standing on a platform being assessed." She glanced toward the street. "Which one's yours?" "The brown—" He stopped. "I just told you the arrangement isn't going to—" "You told me what you thought," Evelyn Cross said pleasantly. "I haven't told you what I think yet, and I think it's too early in the day to make permanent decisions, so—" She looked at him with those sharp, watchful eyes. "The wagon." He pointed at it. She walked toward it. Behind him, he heard Walt Gruber say, low and amused, to the man standing next to him, "Lord help that man." Gideon didn't speak for the first 3 miles out of town. Evelyn didn't seem to require him to. She sat on the bench beside him with her satchel on her knees and watched the landscape with the focused attention of someone taking an inventory. The big sky rolled out ahead of them, pale and vast. The road was rutted and the wagon jolted on every other stone, and she absorbed the jolting without complaint, which irritated Gideon in a way he couldn't quite explain. He'd been hoping she would complain. After a while she said, "What's the name of that creek?" He followed her gaze to the thin silver line running along the base of the far hill. "Mercer Creek. Runs through the east pasture." "Is it usually that low this time of year?" He'd been watching that creek with a knot of anxiety in his chest for 6 weeks. He told himself it was normal seasonal variation. He told himself a lot of things. "Some years," he said. She nodded as if she was filing this information away. A mile later she said, "That pasture on the left, is the fence your land or your neighbor's?" "Mine." "The posts on the north end are leaning." "I know." Another mile of silence. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I want to make something clear since we appear to be operating under some mutual misunderstanding about each other. I didn't ask for a perfect situation," she said. "I asked for an honest one. The agency sent me a description of a working cattle ranch in need of practical management assistance. That's what I was told to prepare for, so that's what I prepared for." She paused. I didn't come to Montana to be decorative. Gideon glanced at her sideways. Why did you come? She seemed to consider the question seriously, as if she wasn't going to give him the easy answer. Virginia had run out of room for me, she said finally. I had opinions about land management that nobody wanted to hear. I had a head for numbers that made the men around me uncomfortable. She stopped. I had been somewhere long enough to know it wasn't the place I was going to build anything, so I left. Another pause. I am very good at ranch management, Mr. Mercer, and I suspect your ranch needs very good management, or you wouldn't have written to an agency looking for help. Gideon stared at the road. He had written to the agency because he was drowning, because the drought had taken a year's worth of growth, and the banknote was due in February, and the fence on the south pasture had failed twice, and there were only so many hours in a day and only so much one man could hold together alone. He'd written to the agency because every practical solution had run out, and this was the last one he could think of. He hadn't written it in the letter that way. I need someone to help run a ranch, he said. Then we should have no problem, said Evelyn Cross. They drove in silence for another mile, and then the Mercer Ranch came into view at the end of the road. The main house with the sagging porch, the big barn with the patched roof, the paddock fence that needed 2 sections replaced, the outbuildings, the dry creek bed at the edge of the property. All of it baking quietly in the morning sun, worn and proud in the way that things are when they've been held together by will rather than money. Gideon watched her look at it. She didn't say anything. She didn't make a sound. She just looked, and he couldn't read her face, and that was worse than whatever she might have said. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house. He climbed down first, out of habit. She climbed down on her own side before he could walk around. She stood for a moment in the yard and looked at the house, looked at the barn, looked at the paddock, looked at the water trough, which was down to 1/3 of its usual level. Then she looked at the fence along the north side of the property. When did you last check that fence? She asked, pointing. Last week? Far end or near end? Near end. She set down her satchel against the porch post and started walking toward the far end of the fence. Miss Cross. He followed her, annoyed and something else he didn't have a word for. You just arrived. I know. She kept walking. The far end of the north fence ran along the tree line, where the property met the low slope of the hill. It was a section Gideon hadn't gotten to in 3 weeks, because 3 weeks ago he'd been dealing with a sick calf and a broken pump and a late payment from the cattle buyer that had left him short in ways he couldn't afford to be short. She stopped at the 7th post from the end. She crouched down and looked at the ground. Gideon stopped beside her. What? She didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the soil around the base of the post. Then she reached out and pressed 2 fingers against the dirt. This post was moved, she said. What? In the last month. She stood. You can see where the soil was disturbed and compressed again. Whoever said it didn't bother tamping it properly. They were in a hurry. She looked out along the fence line, then turned and looked back toward the ranch. Then she looked at the post again. Do you know where your original survey markers are? The cold feeling started somewhere in his sternum. There's one about 30 yards east, he said slowly, at the corner of... He stopped walking because she had already started walking east, threading through the long grass along the fence line with her head down, watching the ground. He followed her, partly because he didn't know what else to do, and partly because the cold feeling was spreading. They found the survey marker right where he remembered it, an iron pin in a stone marker set when his father had registered the property 32 years ago. Gideon had checked it exactly once in his adult life, because why would anyone need to check it? The boundaries were the boundaries. Evelyn crouched beside it. She looked at the marker. She looked at the fence post they'd left behind, maybe 30 yards to the west. She looked at the space between them. Then she looked up at Gideon. Your fence, she said carefully, is not on your property line. The wind moved through the grass. What? His voice came out flat. The fence is set back from the marker by approximately... She stood and looked along the line. 25 feet. The whole north fence line, if I had to guess. She looked at him. Have any of your neighbors been running cattle along that strip? His neighbor to the north was a man named Caldwell. Ran a small herd, kept to himself, never caused trouble. But there had been a summer, 2 summers ago actually, when Gideon had noticed fresh cattle tracks in the long grass along the north line, and assumed it was one of his strays. It hadn't been. "How recent?" he asked. "The moved post is recent." She said it quietly, like she understood the weight of what she was saying. "But a fence that far off the marker didn't get that way in a month. I'd want to look at the east and south lines before I said anything more." She paused. "Mr. Mercer, do you have your original deed?" "In the house." She picked up her satchel, which she had somehow carried all the way down the fence line without him noticing. "Then I'd like to look at it," she said, "before we do anything else." They sat at the kitchen table while the afternoon light moved across the floor, and Evelyn Cross looked at the deed. She looked at it the way she'd looked at everything else, with that focused, cataloging attention, like she was reading something other people might miss. She had also, somewhere in the hours since they'd come back from the fence line, put on a kettle without asking, found where the cups were without being told, and set a mug of coffee at Gideon's elbow without comment. He hadn't thanked her. She hadn't seemed to expect him to. Now she had the deed spread out on the table, and beside it, the county land map that Gideon had dug from a box in the back of the spare room, the one he'd had to blow dust off, because it had been in that box since his father's time. She was tracing something with one finger. "This is your original northeastern boundary," she said, without looking up. "And this?" She traced a line slightly south. "This is where your fence is running." Gideon leaned over the table. The lines were close together, close enough that in a glance you might not see the difference. But looking at it now, with her finger laying out the shape of it, he could see it. 20 years of ranch work, and he'd never seen it. But right now, sitting at his own kitchen table, he could see it. "That's not a drift," he said. "No," she said. "That's a deliberate shift." She looked up at him then, and her expression was careful and even. "I don't know that yet," she said. "I don't want to tell you something is definitely what I think it might be before I know more, but—" She looked back at the map. "I want to check the south and east lines in the morning, and I'd like to know who surveyed this property in the last decade." "Pearson County Surveying," Gideon said. "Every landowner in the valley uses them. Blackridge recommends them." Something moved in her eyes. "Blackridge?" "Silas Blackridge. Owns the Blackridge Land Company. Biggest landowner in the valley." Gideon looked at the map. "Most profitable man in Harlan Creek." She nodded, slow and thoughtful. "How long has he been in the valley?" "Since before I was born. His father established most of the original land arrangements in the county. Silas took it over about 15 years ago, and—" Gideon stopped because something was connecting in his head that he didn't want to connect. "His land abuts mine on 2 sides. The kitchen was very quiet. "You said the last county survey of your property was—" She consulted the deed. 12 years ago, Gideon said. "Required for the banknote." "And who conducted it?" "Pearson County Surveying." She set her hand flat on the map. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I think we need to look at every record you have for this property. And then I think we need to look at the county records too." She looked at him, and her voice was even, but there was something underneath it, not fear, not quite. Something more like the controlled tension of someone who has seen a shape in the dark and is very carefully checking to see what it is. "And we should do it quietly, before we talk to anyone else." Gideon stared at her. 12 hours ago, he had been standing on a stagecoach platform deciding to send her back. Now she was sitting at his kitchen table with her hands on his family's deed, and there was a moved fence post at the back of his property, and Silas Blackridge's name was sitting in the middle of the room between them like a stone dropped in still water. "You've been here 4 hours," he said. "I know," said Evelyn Cross. She refilled his coffee without asking. "I work quickly. Chatel." That evening, while Gideon did the last round of the animals, Evelyn made an inventory. Not of herself, not of her situation. She'd taken stock of that long before she boarded the train in Richmond, and she'd come to terms with it. She made an inventory of the ranch. She walked the paddock fence. She checked the water trough levels and noted the pump pressure. She looked at the hay supply in the barn, did the math in her head about how many animals, how many weeks of winter remaining, whether it would be enough. She looked at the roof patching on the south side of the barn and understood, from the color and texture of the material, that it was the wrong kind and would fail in the first heavy rain. She looked at the account book Gideon had left on the kitchen counter. He hadn't offered it to her, but he hadn't put it away either, which she took as something between an accident and an invitation. And she did the math there too. The math was not good. She had known ranchers in Virginia who operated on tighter margins, who survived on determination and luck and very little else. She had helped two of them sort themselves out before she left, had spent 6 months restructuring a failing cattle operation that everyone else had written off, and she knew the particular shape of a ranch that was being held together by one person's sheer refusal to let it fall. Gideon Mercer's ranch had that shape, but underneath the financial trouble, underneath the deferred repairs and the thinned herd and the accounts that didn't quite balance, there was something else. Something that had been put there deliberately by someone who knew how to hide it. She sat at the kitchen table after Gideon came in, after they ate a supper of beans and salt pork without saying much, after he told her the second bedroom was made up and she could have it, and she sat with her notebook open and wrote down everything she'd seen that day. The moved post, the fence line, the deed, the name of the surveying company. She drew a rough map from memory. She marked the property lines as the deed showed them. She marked where the fence was actually running. She did the math on the acreage, 20 feet off a boundary line that ran nearly a quarter mile. That was close to an acre that had been producing slowly and quietly for Silas Blackridge, or for whoever was running cattle along that strip. She thought about the survey 12 years ago, about who had conducted it, and who had recommended that surveying company, and what it meant that the fence had drifted, or been moved, since then. One property was an accident. One family's fence in the wrong place was a mistake. But if it was happening to the Mercer Ranch, she didn't finish the thought yet. It was too early to finish it. She closed her notebook, put it in her satchel, and sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Through the window, she could see the dark outline of the barn against the sky, and beyond it, the darkness of the pasture, and beyond that, the hills. She thought about what had brought her here, not just the practical reasons, the ones she'd given Gideon in the wagon, the true ones about running out of room, about a life that had gotten smaller and smaller until there was no air in it, not just the logic of it. She thought about this fact that she had gotten off that stagecoach and a man had looked at her and decided in 30 seconds that she was wrong for the situation. And she had felt something cold and bright move through her. Not hurt, exactly. More like recognition. She had spent her entire adult life being decided about before anyone bothered to ask a question. She picked up her satchel and went to bed. In the morning, they would check the south fence line, and then they would go into Harlan Creek and look at the county land records. And she was going to find out what was in those records. The south fence was worse. They found it in the gray morning, before the sun had gotten itself fully over the hills, Gideon on one side with his long stride, and Evelyn on the other with her notebook, measuring the distance between the survey markers and the actual fence posts. 30 feet here, she said, crouching at the marker. Maybe 32. Gideon didn't say anything. His jaw was tight. She marked it in the notebook. And the creek? What about it? Is the creek on your property? He pointed. The west bank is the property line. She looked at the creek, at the thin trickle running low in its bed, at the bank on the west side. She looked at where the fence ended. She did the math. The fence is set well east of the bank, she said. Gideon came around to look. He stood beside her and stared at the gap between where his fence was and where it should have been. That's not a little drift, he said. His voice was flat and contained in the way voices get when someone is holding something down that they don't want to let out in public. No, Evelyn said. That creek feeds the south pasture. I know. If the water rights go with the land, they do. She'd looked it up in the county code the night before, in the small law reference book she traveled with. If someone is holding a claim to that strip of land, they have a claim on the water access. The creek ran thin and pale in the early light. Gideon turned away from it and walked back toward the ranch house, and she let him walk for a minute before she followed. She found him in the barn, doing something unnecessary to the tack that didn't need to be done, the kind of busy hands that weren't actually accomplishing anything. I want to go to the county records office, she said from the doorway. Today. He kept working on the tack. Harlan Creek. Yes. Records office is next to the courthouse. Frank Cully runs it. He stopped. He's what? He's a reasonable man, Gideon said, in a tone that suggested that was not the whole sentence. But he's friendly with Blackridge. Most of the county is. He set the tack down and turned around. You understand what you're suggesting? If there's something in those records, I'm not suggesting anything yet, Evelyn said carefully. I want to look at the records, that's all. Just look. And if what you find suggests what I think you're going to find, then we'll have more information than we have now. He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the thing happening behind his eyes. Not suspicion of her, not anymore, but something older and harder. Something that knew what it meant to go up against powerful men in a small county where everyone knew everyone. You know what Blackridge is, she said. You already knew it before I came. Otherwise, you'd have gone to the records office yourself. His jaw moved. I had suspicions, and you didn't act on them. I have one ranch and one man to run it. His voice had an edge now. If I accuse Silas Blackridge of something and I'm wrong, I lose what's left of my credit in this valley. I lose the banknote. I lose... He stopped. I can't afford to be wrong. I'm not asking you to accuse anyone, Evelyn said. I'm asking you to drive me to the records office. The barn was quiet for a moment. You're not going to let this go, he said. No, she said. He picked up the tack again, and then he put it back down. Wagon will be ready in 20 minutes, he said. The county records office in Harlan Creek occupied a room off the side of the courthouse, which occupied the center of the main street, which meant that when Gideon Mercer drove his wagon up and tied it in front of the courthouse, there were 7 people in the immediate vicinity who watched him do it, and at least 4 of them recognized the woman sitting beside him. Evelyn was aware of the watching. She was always aware of it. She'd been aware of it since she stepped off the stage the day before, since Gideon had refused to shake her hand, and all those people had heard. By the time they'd passed the general store on the way to the records office, she'd caught 3 separate conversations stopping when they went by, and the particular sound of whispers starting up behind them. She didn't react to any of it. She had learned a long time ago that reacting to whispers gave the whisperers exactly what they wanted, and that the most effective response to people trying to make you feel small was to refuse, simply to be made small. Frank Cully was a soft-faced man with reading glasses and the slightly harried look of someone who dealt with paperwork all day and never quite caught up. He looked up when they came in, blinked at Evelyn, then looked at Gideon. Gideon, he said, haven't seen you in a while. Morning, Frank, Gideon said. I heard you. Cully stopped, reorganized himself. This is the young lady from... This is my wife, Gideon said. The word came out evenly, not quite comfortable, but firm. Evelyn looked at him briefly and said nothing. Pleasure to meet you, Cully said to Evelyn, with the automatic politeness of a man who is slightly flustered but well-mannered. What can I do for you folks? Land records, Evelyn said, for Mercer Ranch and the surrounding properties. Surveys and deed transfers going back 20 years. Cully's eyes moved to Gideon. All of them? All of them, Gideon said. They stayed in that office for 4 hours. Cully brought them box after box, each one holding the accumulated paper history of Harlan Creek's land ownership, deed transfers and survey records and county assessments and boundary disputes going back to the valley's earliest settled years. He was helpful in the way that bureaucrats are helpful when they're not sure what someone is looking for and therefore can't decide whether to be obstructive. Evelyn read. She read everything. She had a system. She'd had a system since she was 16 years old and had taught herself to manage her family's failing accounts after her father got sick. Had developed it further over years of working in situations where someone needed to find the thing that other people were trying to hide. Gideon watched her work and said almost nothing. He'd brought coffee in a flask from the diner across the street. He'd done it without asking, set it next to her without comment, which was something. And he sat across the table from her and looked at the pages she put in front of him and tried to follow what she was following. Around the second hour, she set a deed transfer in front of him. What do you know about the Alderman family? She asked quietly. Used to have a place on the east side of the valley, Gideon said. Left about 12 years ago. I was told they sold. They did. She pointed at the transfer document. For a third of what the property was assessed at the year before, and... She laid another document beside it, a survey report. The year before they sold, they had a boundary dispute with Blackridge Land Company. The disputed strip was resolved in Blackridge's favor. Gideon stared at the documents. Who resolved it? He asked. County assessor. She laid a third document down. Signed by a man named Thomas Greer. He retired 3 years ago. He did. She looked up. The Pearson family. Do you know them? Small place up on the north side. Lost it maybe 8, 9 years ago. She laid out more documents. The pattern was the same. Survey discrepancy. A boundary dispute. A resolution in Blackridge's favor. A distressed sale. She laid out 5 more sets of documents. The pattern held. How many families? Gideon said. She counted. 7 that I can find clearly documented. There may be more that I'm not seeing yet because the transfers are buried in the routine records. 7 families. 7 properties. He's been doing it for 20 years, Gideon said. His voice was very quiet. At least, Evelyn said. She gathered the documents into a careful stack. She pulled her notebook from her satchel and began making a list of names, dates, amounts, surveyors. We need copies, she said, as many as possible. Frank Cully, she said. I suspect we should not ask to make copies, not of these. She looked at her notebook. I need paper and enough time. She spent the next 2 hours copying. Every number, every date, every name. Gideon helped. She handed him documents and told him what to write, and he wrote it, his handwriting less neat than hers but readable, filling pages of the notebook while she worked through her own sheets. Cully came to check on them twice. Both times Evelyn smiled pleasantly and said they were nearly done, and both times Cully nodded and went back to his desk. But the second time his eyes moved over the stack of documents in a way that made the back of Evelyn's neck prickle. When they finally walked out of the records office into the afternoon sun, Gideon said quietly, without looking at her, He's going to tell Blackridge we were in there. Yes, Evelyn said, probably before supper, which means Blackridge will know he'll know we were looking. She adjusted the satchel on her shoulder. He won't know what we found, and he won't know what we're going to do with it. Do you know what we're going to do with it? She thought about the stack of documents, about 7 families, about water rights and survey markers and a fence set 30 feet off a boundary line. Not yet, she said honestly, but I'm working on it. They walked back to the wagon. On the way, a man stepped out of the doorway of the land company office and looked at them with small, flat eyes. He was broad-shouldered and well-dressed, with the particular ease of someone who has never in his life worried about a banknote. Gideon's step slowed almost imperceptibly. Evelyn didn't look at the man, but she saw him. She felt the shape of his attention, the way it moved from Gideon to her and rested there, measuring. That's Blackridge, Gideon said, so low she barely heard it. I know, she said. She had known, before he told her, from the way Gideon's posture had changed and from the particular quality of the man's stillness. The stillness of someone who is accustomed to being the most powerful person in any given situation and doesn't bother to pretend otherwise. He watched them walk to the wagon. He watched them climb up. He watched them turn out onto the road. He was still watching when they drove out of sight. He knows, Gideon said. He suspects, Evelyn said. That's different. She held the satchel on her lap. He doesn't know what we know. He doesn't know what we're going to do. She looked at the road ahead. And he doesn't know what kind of person I am. Gideon drove. The wagon wheels turned in the dust. Neither do I, he said after a while. She looked at him. I'm starting to, though, he added, and his voice was not warm, not yet, not from a man who had built walls high enough to block the sky, but it was honest, and honest was something. That's fair, Evelyn said. They drove home in the late afternoon light, and the satchel on her knees was full of notes that 7 families would have given everything to have, and somewhere behind them in a well-dressed office on the main street of Harlan Creek, Silas Blackridge was picking up a telephone to make a call that would change the nature of what was coming. But that was later. Right now there was the road, and the ranch at the end of it, and a notebook full of numbers that meant something, and 2 people who had started the morning as strangers and were ending it as something else. Something with a name neither of them was ready to use yet. The sun went down. The work was just beginning. Silas Blackridge did not pick up the telephone right away. He sat behind his desk for a long while after watching the wagon disappear down the road, turning a pen over in his fingers, doing the kind of slow, careful thinking that had made him the richest man in the valley and kept him that way for 15 years. Frank Cully would call within the hour, he knew. Cully always called. The man had the backbone of wet paper and the loyalty of a dog that had been fed once and never forgot it. The call came at 4:15. "Mr. Blackridge?" Cully's voice had that particular nervous brightness it got whenever he was about to deliver news he suspected wouldn't be welcome. "Thought you'd want to know. Gideon Mercer was in the records office today, him and his new wife." "What were they looking at?" "Land transfers, survey records, going back 20 years. A pause. "They were thorough about it, Mr. Blackridge. The woman, she knew exactly what she was looking for, took notes for hours." Blackridge was quiet for a moment. "Which properties?" "Couldn't say for certain, but I saw the Alderman file out and the Pearson file, and I believe the Whitfield transfer as well." The pen stopped turning. Those three names, pulled together in one afternoon by a woman who'd been in the valley less than 2 days, told Blackridge everything he needed to know about how serious this was. Anyone could stumble onto one bad transfer and assume it was bad luck. Nobody stumbled onto 3 in an afternoon unless they already understood the shape of what they were looking for. "Thank you, Frank," he said, and hung up before Cully could ask the question hanging in his voice. "What do you want me to do about it?" He didn't know yet what he wanted done about it. That was the trouble with surprises. They required thinking, and thinking took time. And time was the one thing he wasn't sure he had now that someone with a sharp mind and a notebook had gotten loose in his county. He thought about Gideon Mercer first, because Gideon was the known quantity. A proud man, stubborn, in debt up to his ears, the kind of rancher who'd rather lose everything than ask for help. Blackridge had been counting on that pride to bring the Mercer place down eventually. The slow way, the way he'd done with the others. No confrontation needed, just patience, and a fence post moved a few feet every year or two, and a banknote that got harder to pay every season the water ran thinner. The woman was the unknown quantity. He didn't like unknown quantities. He picked up the telephone again, this time to call his foreman, a heavy-set man named Otis Dunn, who had been with the Blackridge operation since before Silas inherited it. "Otis," he said, "I want eyes on the Mercer place. Not close, just know what's happening over there. Who comes, who goes." "You worried about something, boss?" "I'm careful about something," Blackridge said. "There's a difference." At the ranch, Evelyn spent the evening doing what she had spent every evening since arriving doing, organizing, sorting, building a structure out of facts that on their own looked like nothing and together looked like a crime. She'd spread her notes across the kitchen table in neat columns. Names of families on the left, dates of dispute in the middle, names of surveyors and assessors and bank officials on the right, where they appeared. By the time Gideon came in from the evening chores, smelling like hay and cold air, she had built something close to a ledger of theft, except the ledger had no entry yet for what anyone intended to do about it. He stood at the edge of the table and looked down at it. "You've got 7 families there," he said. 8 now. She tapped a new line she'd added that afternoon. One she'd cross-referenced from an assessor's note she'd nearly missed the first time through. "The Hutchins place, sold off 4 years ago. Same pattern. Boundary dispute, resolved against them, distressed sale within the year." Gideon pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, heavy, like a man whose legs had finally admitted how tired they were. "I knew the Hutchins boy," he said. "We went to school together. His family had that land since before mine did." He looked at the page like it had personally wronged him. He never said a word about a dispute, just one day they were gone. Moved to Idaho, I heard. "Did anyone ask him why?" "Nobody asks why people leave," Gideon said. "Folks just figure the land beat them. Drought, debt, bad luck. That's the story everybody tells themselves because it's easier than the other story." "What's the other story?" He looked at her. "That somebody did it to them on purpose, and the whole county let it happen because they were either too scared or too comfortable to say anything." The kitchen was quiet except for the low pop of the fire in the stove. "That's a story I think is true," Evelyn said. "I know it is." He rubbed a hand over his face. "I think I've known it for longer than I wanted to admit. You don't run a ranch in this valley for 20 years without hearing things, little things. A man losing his nerve about a boundary fight he should have won. A bank suddenly calling a note early. You hear it, and you tell yourself it's not your business, because minding your own business is the only way to survive around a man like Blackridge. And now? Now my own fence is 30 feet off the line," Gideon said, "and it is my business." She watched him for a moment. The the way the firelight moved across his face, the particular exhaustion of a man discovering that the danger he'd spent years avoiding had been standing in his own pasture the whole time. "I don't want to move too fast," she said finally. "If we go to the sheriff now with what we have, he'll either ignore it because Blackridge owns him, or he'll warn Blackridge before he does anything else. Either way, we lose the only advantage we have." "Which is?" "He doesn't know how much we know." She straightened her stack of papers. "Frank Cully will have told him we were in the records office. He'll be worried. Worried men make mistakes, or they make moves. And either way, that tells us something we didn't know before." Gideon studied her. "You've done this before." "Not exactly this," she said, "but something like it. Looking for the things someone worked hard to hide." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't push, though something in his face suggested he was filing the comment away to ask about later. "So what do we do?" he said, "while we wait for him to make a mistake?" "We keep building the record," Evelyn said. "Quietly, we talk to people who might remember things Frank Cully's files don't say outright. And we don't tell anyone in town what we found today. Not Walt Gruber, not Ida Crane, not anyone who will repeat it before we're ready." "That's going to be hard," Gideon said. "This is a small town. People talk." "Then we give them something else to talk about." She allowed herself the faintest trace of a smile. "We're already the most interesting thing that's happened around here in months. Let them talk about the mail-order bride and the rancher who tried to send her back. As long as that's the story they're telling, they're not telling the other one." Gideon almost laughed. It surprised him, the sound of it, like his chest wasn't used to making that particular shape anymore. "You're using our own embarrassment as cover," he said. "I'm using whatever's available," Evelyn said. "That's the only way this works." The next 2 weeks went by in a strange, careful rhythm. By day, Evelyn worked the ranch the way she'd promised, and worked it hard. She fixed the fence on the south pasture with her own 2 hands the first morning, after watching Gideon attempt the same repair the wrong way 3 days running, and didn't say a word about his method except to ask if he had a different kind of wire in the barn. She rebalanced the account book until the numbers actually told the truth about where the ranch stood, which was bad, but at least it was honest bad instead of confused bad. She found the leak in the water line that had been bleeding pressure from the trough for months, and traced it to a cracked pipe joint Gideon hadn't known existed. She did not do any of it gently. She did not soften her observations to spare his pride. When she found a problem, she named it plainly, the way she'd named the fence problem on her first afternoon. And more than once, Gideon felt the sting of being told, calmly and without malice, that something he'd been doing for years was being done wrong. "You've been running this place on stubbornness," she told him one evening, not unkindly, after she'd shown him a faster way to mend a section of paddock fence that would have taken him an extra 2 hours his way. "Stubbornness keeps a thing from collapsing. It doesn't make it grow." "That's supposed to be a compliment." "It's an observation," she said. "Compliments are different. I'll let you know when I'm giving one." He found himself, against every instinct he'd built over the past 6 years, looking forward to whether she would. By evening, after the chores were done and supper eaten, they worked on the ledger of names. Evelyn had begun riding into town under small pretenses, buying flour, asking after seed prices, sitting a spell with Ida Crane on the porch of the general store, letting the woman talk. Because Ida Crane loved nothing more in this world than being the one who knew things, and a woman willing to listen without interrupting could learn a great deal from her in an afternoon. It was from Ida that Evelyn learned the name of the bank officer who'd called in 3 of the early notes against struggling families, a man named Hollis Reed, who had since moved to Bozeman and, according to Ida, had done rather well for himself in a manner that didn't entirely make sense for a small-town loan clerk. It was from a quiet, careful conversation with the blacksmith, a man named Earl Tabor, who'd shod horses for half the families on Evelyn's list before they left the valley, that she learned something else, that several of those families hadn't simply sold and moved on quietly. 2 of them, Earl said, had tried to fight the boundary rulings in court and lost, represented by the same lawyer each time, a man on retainer with the county who somehow always seemed to find against the smaller landowner. "You're asking an awful lot of questions for a woman who just got here," Earl said to her, not unkindly, while he worked a shoe onto Gideon's gelding. "I like to understand a place before I settle into it," Evelyn said. Earl looked up at her, and something passed across his weathered face. Recognition, maybe, of a person doing something he understood the shape of, even if he couldn't name it outright. "You be careful who you understand it in front of," he said quietly, and went back to his work and said nothing more on the subject, but the warning sat with her the whole ride home. She told Gideon about it that night. "Earl Tabor as good as told me to be careful," she said, setting down her satchel. "Which means he knows something, and it means word is already moving that I'm asking questions." Gideon's expression went tight in the way it did now whenever Blackridge's shadow crossed into the conversation. "Did he say who you should be careful of?" "He didn't have to." Gideon stood by the window, looking out at the dark shape of the barn, the paddock beyond it, the fence line that ran crooked and wrong 30 feet off where it should have stood. "Otis Dunn rode the north boundary twice this week," he said. "Told me he was checking a stray. I've known Otis Dunn 15 years. He's never once checked a stray on my land without me asking him to. He's watching us." "He's watching you," Gideon said. "Watching what you're doing, whether you're the kind of trouble Blackridge ought to worry about." "And what do you think he's decided?" Gideon turned from the window. In the lamplight, his face had lost some of the hardness it had carried the day she arrived. Not all of it, not yet, but enough that she could see the man underneath the walls more clearly than she had that first morning at the stagecoach platform. "I think he's decided you're exactly the kind of trouble he ought to worry about," he said. "I think that's why Otis is riding my fence line pretending to look for cattle that don't exist." Evelyn sat down at the table, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's physical work. "Then we should expect him to move." "Move how?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "Men like Blackridge don't usually attack the thing they're afraid of directly. Not at first. They go around it. They go at the edges." She was right, though neither of them knew yet how quickly. It started small, the way these things usually do. Comment here, a whisper there, nothing a person could point to directly and call an attack. Ida Crane, who 2 weeks earlier had been delighted to sit on her porch and gossip with the new Mrs. Mercer, suddenly developed a coolness whenever Evelyn came into the general store. A delivery of seed that Gideon had ordered and paid for in advance failed to arrive on schedule, and when he rode in to ask about it, the store owner suddenly couldn't quite recall the order, though he'd written it in his own ledger himself. Then came the worst thing. It started with a woman named Mrs. Pruitt, who ran the boarding house at the edge of town and who, according to Ida, who delivered this information with the particular relish of someone passing along something she didn't fully believe but enjoyed repeating anyway, had been telling anyone who would listen that the new Mrs. Mercer wasn't really from Virginia at all, that she'd come from somewhere with a different sort of reputation, that a woman so quick with numbers and so comfortable talking to men about land deeds had probably learned those skills in places decent women didn't learn them. Evelyn heard the whole thing secondhand from Ida herself, delivered with a kind of testing carefulness, as if Ida wanted to see how Evelyn would react before deciding what to believe. Evelyn didn't react the way Ida seemed to expect. "Is that what people are saying?" she asked, calm as still water. "Some people," Ida said, watching her closely. "Well," Evelyn folded the fabric she'd been examining at the counter, set it down, paid for it without complaint. "I suppose they'll believe whatever's easiest to believe. I can't control that. I can only control whether it's true." She looked at Ida directly. "It isn't." She left the store without raising her voice, without defending herself further, without giving Ida or anyone listening the satisfaction of watching her come apart. But it cost her something to do it. Gideon could see that when she came home, in the particular stiffness of her shoulders, in the way she set her basket down harder than necessary. "They're saying things about you in town," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Lies." "Of course they're lies." She looked at him, and there was an edge under her calm now, thin but real. "That's how it's done, isn't it? You can't disprove gossip in an afternoon, but you can spend years undoing the damage of it. He's not coming after the land records. He's coming after whether anyone will believe me if I ever stand up and say what's in them." Gideon felt something hard settle in his chest. Not surprised, because some part of him had expected exactly this, but a kind of cold, focused anger that had nowhere yet to go. "I'll go talk to Mrs. Pruitt myself," he said. "No." Evelyn's voice was sharp enough to stop him at the door. "That's exactly what he wants. You, defending your wife's honor in public, making a scene, giving the whole town something dramatic to watch and talk about for another month. That's not strength, Gideon. That's exactly the distraction he's hoping for." "So what do I do? Just let people say that about you?" "You let it sit," she said. You let her keep talking, and every single thing she says that isn't true, we remember. Because a woman who's willing to lie about me in public is a woman who'll eventually slip and tell us where she heard it. Lies have a source. We just have to be patient enough to trace it. Gideon stood there a long moment, fists half curled at his sides, every instinct in him wanting to ride into town and do something loud and useless. "You're better at this than I am," he said finally, and it came out rougher than he meant it to, like an admission he hadn't planned on making. "I've had more practice," Evelyn said. "Being underestimated, being talked about. It teaches you patience eventually, or it breaks you. I decided a long time ago which one I was going to let it do." He looked at her for a long time after that, and something in his chest, something that had been locked up tight since long before she ever stepped off that stagecoach, shifted a half-inch, just enough to let a little light through. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I don't believe a word they're saying." "I know," Evelyn said. "That's why I'm still standing in your kitchen." The pressure didn't stop, though. If anything, it sharpened. A week later, the bank sent a notice. Not a foreclosure, not yet, but a letter reminding Gideon that his note was due in full come February, with language colder and more formal than any previous correspondence he'd received from them in 6 years of barely scraping by. Gideon recognized the hand behind it before Evelyn even said the name out loud. "Blackridge sits on the bank board," he said, staring at the letter. "I knew that, never thought much of it before." "You should think about it now," Evelyn said. "He's reminding you what he can do, not all at once, just enough to make you nervous, make you doubt whether digging into his business is worth what it might cost you. Is it working?" She looked at him steadily. "Is it?" Gideon set the letter down on the table, hard enough that the lamp beside it rattled. "No," he said. "It's not." Something in the set of his jaw told her he meant it. Not bravado, not the stubborn pride she'd clocked in him the first morning, but something that had grown into resolve, slow and deliberate, over the 2 weeks since she'd found that moved fence post. "Good," Evelyn said, "because I don't think he's done yet. I think this is just him testing how much weight it takes to make us back away. And if it's not enough," she thought of Earl Tabor's warning and Otis Dunn riding the fence line for cattle that didn't exist, and the particular flat stillness in Silas Blackridge's eyes, the one time she'd seen him in person, outside the records office, watching them climb into their wagon like a man cataloging a problem he intended to solve. "Then he'll find something heavier," she said. "We should be ready for that before it happens, not after." Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing low and steady across the dry grass of the south pasture, rattling the loose shingle on the barn roof that neither of them had gotten around to fixing yet. Somewhere out past the tree line, the boundary fence still ran 30 feet wrong, a quiet, patient lie standing in the dark, waiting for someone braver than the men who'd let it stand there for 20 years to finally call it what it was. Neither of them said anything else that night. There was nothing left to say that the silence between them didn't already understand, that the easy part, whatever there had been of it, was over, and that whatever came next would cost more than a fence post or a bad rumor in town. It would cost something neither of them had fully reckoned with yet. Marian Blackridge had been awake since before dawn, sitting at her dressing table in the dark, listening to her husband's breathing slow into sleep down the hall before she allowed herself to move. She had been married to Silas Blackridge for 19 years. She had spent the better part of those years learning the particular geography of his moods, the way a sailor learns a coastline, which silences meant he was thinking, which ones meant he was angry, which ones meant something had frightened him badly enough that he needed to be alone with it before he decided what to do. The silence she'd been living inside for the past 2 weeks was the third kind. She had only seen it a handful of times before, and each time it had ended with someone in the valley losing everything they had. She knew because she had been the one who kept his books for the first 10 years of their marriage, before he decided a wife with too much knowledge of the accounts was a liability and hired a clerk instead. She knew where the bodies were, so to speak. Not literal ones, she told herself, though some nights she wasn't entirely sure of that either, thinking of old Mr. Pearson, who died of what the doctor called a weak heart less than a year after losing his land, dead at 51, with no history of any such weakness before. She knew about the Aldermans, the Pearsons, the Whitfields. The Hutchins boy whose family left in the night like they were running from something worse than debt, because they were. She had told herself, for years, that staying quiet was the only thing she could do, that a woman with no money of her own, no family willing to take her back, no standing in a county that belonged almost entirely to her husband, had no real choices to make. She had built an entire life around that story, had furnished it carefully, had decorated it with charity work and quiet dinners, and the particular performance of a contented wife, because the alternative was admitting what she actually was, which was a witness who had decided for 19 years to look away. The new Mercer woman had changed something in her without ever once speaking to her. Marian had heard about Evelyn Cross the same way everyone in Harlan Creek had, through Ida Crane's relentless circulation of gossip, through her husband's clipped, irritated mentions of the Mercer situation, through the particular tension that had settled over her own household since the day Silas came back from town, having seen with his own eyes a woman calmly carrying a notebook full of his secrets out of the county records office. She had asked him about it once, carefully, over supper. "Is something troubling you?" she'd said. "You seem distracted." "Nothing that concerns you," he'd answered in the tone he used when something concerned her very much indeed. That had been 2 weeks ago. Since then, she had watched him send Otis Dunn to ride fences that didn't need riding, watched him place a call to the bank about a note that wasn't yet due, watched him sit in his study some nights with the lamp burning long after she'd gone to bed, doing the kind of careful, patient thinking he did whenever he was deciding how much damage he was willing to cause to protect what he had. She thought about the Mercer woman more than she expected to. A stranger who'd stepped off a stagecoach into a county that ran entirely on Silas Blackridge's money and his fear, and instead of learning to be quiet the way every other person in the valley had learned to be quiet, had apparently spent her first afternoon finding the one thing nobody else had bothered to look for in 20 years. Marian didn't know Evelyn Cross, had never spoken a single word to her, but she found herself, in the deep quiet of those sleepless nights, thinking, someone finally has the nerve. And then thinking, with the particular shame of a woman who has spent 2 decades calling her own silent survival, and I am going to let her face him alone, the way I let all the others face him alone. It was that second thought, more than anything else, that finally moved her. She had a box. She had kept it for 11 years, since the year she'd quietly begun setting aside copies of things. Letters Silas left lying around after he'd had too much to drink and stopped being careful. Receipts from men he paid in cash for services he never described to her. A ledger page she'd copied by hand one night while he slept, recording payments to a surveyor and a county assessor in amounts that had no honest explanation. She hadn't known, at the time, exactly why she was doing it. She'd told herself it was nothing, just a nervous habit, a woman keeping papers the way some women kept diaries. She knew now it had never been nothing. Some part of her, some part she'd refused to listen to for over a decade, had been building a case against her own husband the entire time, waiting for a moment when she might finally be brave enough to use it. The box was hidden beneath a false bottom in her sewing chest, under spools of thread and half-finished embroidery that nobody, least of all Silas, had any reason to disturb. She took it out on a Tuesday afternoon while Silas was in town, and the house was empty except for the housekeeper, who Marian had long ago learned to trust with small secrets, if not this one. She sat on the floor of her bedroom with the box open in her lap and went through it piece by piece, hands shaking, reading things she had read 100 times before but had never once allowed herself to fully understand as what they were. A letter from Thomas Greer, the retired assessor, written 4 years before his retirement, thanking Silas for his continued generosity regarding the boundary matters discussed. A receipt for $2,000, paid in cash, to a man whose name she recognized as the lawyer who'd represented the county against both the Aldermans and the Whitfields in their boundary disputes. A surveyor's working notes, not the official survey, but the rough notes that had come before it, showing the original, correct boundary line for the Pearson property, crossed out in pencil and redrawn 30 feet to the east. And the ledger page, the one she'd copied herself. Dates and amounts spanning 6 years, payments that had no business existing if everything Silas did was as clean as he told the county, told the bank, told her it was. She sat with the box in her lap for a long time before she closed it. Then she got up, dressed in her plainest clothes, the ones that wouldn't draw attention, and told the housekeeper she was going into town to visit a friend. She did not go to the Mercer Ranch directly. She was not foolish, whatever else she might have been for the past 19 years. She knew that if anyone saw Marion Blackridge's carriage turning up the road to Gideon Mercer's property, the whole county would know about it by supper, and her husband would know about it before that. Instead, she sent a note, folded small, delivered by a girl from town she paid $1, and told nothing. A note addressed simply to Mrs. Mercer, asking if she might call on her at the boarding house at the edge of town, on a matter of some delicacy, at 3 o'clock the following day. Evelyn received the note from Ida Crane's youngest daughter, who delivered it with the kind of wide-eyed curiosity that suggested she'd already tried and failed to read it through the folded paper. She read it twice at the kitchen table before she showed it to Gideon. "Marion Blackridge," she said, setting it down. Gideon picked it up and read it himself, his brow furrowing. "What would she want with you?" "I don't know," Evelyn said, "but I intend to find out." "It could be a trap." Gideon's voice had gone hard immediately, the protective edge that had been growing in him steadily over the past weeks. "Blackridge sending his wife to draw you out somewhere quiet, away from the ranch?" "It's possible," Evelyn agreed. "But think about what we know of her. 19 years married to that man, and not one person in this valley has a single bad word to say about Marion Blackridge. Not the kind of cruelty her husband's known for. People speak of her like she's a ghost in her own house. That doesn't mean she's not loyal to him." "No," Evelyn said, "it doesn't. But it also doesn't mean she's not desperate enough after 19 years to finally do something about what she's watched him do." She folded the note carefully. "I'm going." "Then I'm coming with you." "No." Evelyn's voice was firm, but not unkind. "If she wanted to speak to both of us, she'd have said so. She asked for me alone. If I bring you, she may lose her nerve before she says a word, and we'll have wasted whatever chance this is." She looked at him steadily. "I'll take the wagon myself. I'll be careful, and I'll tell you everything the moment I'm home." Gideon didn't like it. She could see that plainly in the set of his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes that had become familiar to her over these past weeks. Not the cold distance of the man who'd refused her hand on the platform, but something warmer and more complicated. The particular tension of a man who had let himself begin to care about what happened to someone and didn't entirely know what to do with the feeling. "Be careful," he said finally, because there was nothing else to say that wouldn't be an argument she'd already won. "I will," Evelyn said. The boarding house parlor was small and overfurnished, the kind of room decorated by someone trying very hard to seem respectable. Marion Blackridge was already seated when Evelyn arrived, in a high-backed chair near the window, dressed plainly, a shawl pulled close around her shoulders despite the mild afternoon. She looked up when Evelyn came in, and Evelyn was struck immediately by the woman's eyes, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for far too long. "Mrs. Mercer," Marion said. "Thank you for coming." "Mrs. Blackridge." Evelyn sat across from her, in the chair Marion gestured toward. "Your note said a matter of delicacy." Marion's hands moved in her lap, restless, folding and refolding the edge of her shawl. "I imagine you've wondered why I asked to see you." "I have." "I imagine you've also wondered," Marion said, her voice dropping lower, "whether I'm here on my husband's behalf." "That thought crossed my mind, yes." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile moved across Marion's face, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "I would be surprised if it hadn't. You strike me as a woman who considers things carefully before she acts." She looked toward the window, at the quiet street beyond it, and Evelyn understood she was checking, making certain no one was watching the boarding house, no one passing too slowly outside. "I am not here on his behalf, Mrs. Mercer. I am here entirely against what he would want, if he knew." Evelyn said nothing, waiting. "I know what you found in the records office," Marion said. "Or some part of it, at least. Frank Cully told my husband, and my husband, when he is frightened, talks in his sleep." Her hands stilled in her lap. "I have known for a long time what my husband has done to this valley. I have known the names, the Aldermans, the Pearsons, the Whitfields, the Hutchins boy, whose family ran in the night. I have known, and I have said nothing, for 19 years. Her voice had begun to shake, just slightly, on the last few words. "Why are you telling me this now?" Evelyn asked, gently. Marion looked at her directly then, and there was something fierce underneath the exhaustion, something that had clearly been building for a very long time and had finally found a place to go. "Because you didn't say nothing," she said. "You got off a stagecoach in a county you'd never seen before, in a marriage you didn't choose for love, and within 2 days you found what I spent 19 years too frightened to say out loud. I have watched my husband destroy 7 families, 8, I understand, if you found the Hutchins matter too. And I told myself every single time that there was nothing I could do, that a woman with no money and no family of her own had no choices. I have been telling myself that lie for so long, I nearly believed it." She drew a breath that trembled at the edges. "I don't believe it anymore." "What are you telling me, Mrs. Blackridge?" "I have a box," Marion said. "Letters, receipts, a surveyor's working notes for the Pearson property, showing where the line was before it was moved. A ledger I copied myself years ago, recording payments to men who had no honest reason to be paid by my husband." She reached into the bag at her feet. Evelyn hadn't noticed it until now. A worn cloth satchel that looked entirely unremarkable, exactly the sort of thing nobody would think to question, and drew out a small wooden box, plain, unlocked, the kind a person might keep buttons or thread in. "It's all in here. Everything I've kept. Everything that proves what he's done." She held it out. Evelyn didn't take it immediately. "Why give this to me? You could take it to the sheriff yourself." "The sheriff in this county answers to my husband the same way Frank Cully does," Marion said. "If I walk into that office with this box, it will be in Silas's hands before supper, and I will be—" She stopped, and something in her face went very still, very careful. "I have nowhere else to go, Mrs. Mercer. No family who would take me in against him. No money that isn't his. If I do this, I lose everything I have, and I am telling you that because I want you to understand exactly what it means that I am still asking you to take it." The room was quiet for a long moment. "He'll know it's missing," Evelyn said. "Yes. He'll know it was you. Eventually, perhaps not immediately." Marion's hands were steady now, the box held out between them, no longer trembling. "I have already made arrangements. A cousin in Helena who will take me in, who has agreed to say nothing if Silas comes asking. I leave on the morning stage the day after tomorrow. By the time he realizes what's gone, I'll be too far away for him to easily reach. And if he does reach you," Marion's mouth tightened just slightly, "then I will have at least done one true thing in 19 years of doing none." She pushed the box another few inches toward Evelyn. "Please, take it. I cannot carry this any longer, and I think you are the only person in this valley with both the nerve and the sense to use it properly." Evelyn looked at the box for a long moment, then she reached out and took it. It was lighter than she expected, given everything Marion had said was inside it. She supposed that was always the way with secrets. They weighed almost nothing in the hand and everything in the carrying. "Thank you," Evelyn said quietly. "I mean that." Marion let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep, somewhere that had been holding its shape for a very long time. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me if it works. If it doesn't—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They sat together a moment longer, 2 women who had nothing in common except the particular understanding of what it cost to refuse to stay quiet, and then Marion stood, gathered her shawl around her, and walked to the door. "Mrs. Mercer," she said, pausing with her hand on the frame, "for what it's worth, I hope your marriage becomes something real. I hope it isn't only a business arrangement that happened to land you in the middle of this." She looked back briefly. "Mine never did. I want you to have what I didn't." She was gone before Evelyn could answer. Evelyn carried the box home wrapped in a shawl of her own, tucked beneath the wagon seat, and did not breathe easily until the ranch came into view at the end of the road. Gideon was waiting on the porch when she pulled in. She suspected he had been waiting there for most of the afternoon, though he didn't say so. And the moment he saw her face, he came down the steps before the wagon had fully stopped. "What happened?" She didn't answer until they were inside, until the box was sitting on the kitchen table between them, and the door was shut and the curtains drawn, an instinct she hadn't questioned, only obeyed. "Marion Blackridge has been keeping a record," Evelyn said, "for years. Everything her husband never thought a frightened, quiet wife would have the nerve to write down." She opened the box and began laying the contents on the table, piece by piece, The same careful cataloging instinct that had found the moved fence post weeks earlier now turned on something far larger. Letters, receipts, a surveyor's original notes for the Pearson land before the line was moved, a ledger she copied by hand. Gideon stood over the table, looking at it the way a man looks at something he has wanted to see for a very long time and is almost afraid is too good to be real. "This proves it," he said. "All of it. Not just suspicion. Proof." "It proves a great deal," Evelyn said. "It doesn't prove everything yet, but combined with what we already found in the county records, the pattern, the dates, the names, I think it's enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough to take outside this county," Evelyn said. "Because you were right weeks ago when you said the sheriff answers to Blackridge and the bank sits on his board and half the records office owes him favors. We can't win this here. We have to take it somewhere he doesn't own." Gideon picked up the ledger page, the one Marion had copied in her own hand, and stared at the dates, the amounts, the names. "She's leaving him," he said quietly. "Day after tomorrow. Morning stage to a cousin in Helena." Evelyn watched his face. "She gave up everything to hand us this box, Gideon. Whatever happens next, we owe it to her not to waste it." He set the ledger page down carefully, like it might tear, like it mattered more than paper had any right to matter. "He's going to know it's missing," Gideon said. "He's going to know exactly who took it, and he's not a man who's going to take that quietly." "No," Evelyn agreed, "he isn't." As if summoned by the thought itself, there came the sound of hooves on the road outside. Not the slow, deliberate pace of Otis Dunn pretending to check for strays, but something faster, harder, a rider coming in at speed. Gideon was at the window before Evelyn had finished standing. "It's not Otis," he said low. "It's Blackridge himself." Through the gap in the curtain, Evelyn watched a single rider pull up hard in front of the house, dust rising around the horse's legs, and swing down from the saddle with the controlled, contained fury of a man who had spent his whole life believing nothing in this valley could touch him, and had just discovered, within the last hour, that something finally had. "He knows already," Evelyn said. "How could he know already? She only left this afternoon." "He doesn't know about the box yet," Evelyn said, already moving, sweeping the papers back into their wooden container, sliding it beneath the loose floorboard near the stove that Gideon had shown her only the week before, the one he kept his small store of emergency cash in. "But he knows we were seen leaving the boarding house together. That's enough to bring him here himself instead of sending Otis." The hooves stopped. Boots hit the porch steps, heavy and unhurried, the particular unhurried quality of a man who never had to rush because the whole world had always waited for him. Gideon straightened, squared his shoulders, and walked to the door before the knock came. He opened it to find Silas Blackridge standing on his porch in the fading afternoon light, hat in hand, smiling in a way that didn't touch his eyes at all. "Gideon," Blackridge said pleasantly, "I think it's time you and I had a conversation." Behind Gideon, in the kitchen, Evelyn straightened the floorboard back into place and stood, her heart loud in her own ears, and understood with absolute clarity that whatever conversation was about to happen on that porch was not going to be the kind either man could walk away from unchanged. Gideon didn't step aside to let him in. "We can talk right here," he said. Blackridge's smile didn't waver, but something behind it adjusted, the way a man's expression adjusts when he realizes the easy version of a conversation isn't going to be available to him. "Suit yourself." He glanced past Gideon's shoulder toward the dim shape of the kitchen, where he clearly knew Evelyn was standing even if he couldn't see her. "Mrs. Mercer, I hope you don't mind me dropping in unannounced." "Mr. Blackridge," Evelyn said, stepping into the doorway beside Gideon, her voice even. "What can we do for you?" "I think you know." He turned his hat slowly in his hands, an idle gesture that didn't match the stillness in his eyes. "You and your husband have been spending a great deal of time in places that don't concern you. County records, boarding houses." A pause, calculated to land. "My wife." Gideon's jaw tightened. "Marion came to town to visit a friend." "Marion doesn't have friends in this county she visits without telling me first," Blackridge said. 19 years of marriage. I'd know." "Maybe you don't know her as well as you think," Evelyn said. The smile finally slipped, just at the edges. "I know her well enough." He looked at Evelyn directly now, and whatever pleasantness he'd been wearing for the benefit of the porch conversation thinned out until what was underneath it showed plainly. A man accustomed to controlling every situation he found himself in, discovering that this one had slipped partway out of his hands. I'll be straightforward, since straightforward seems to be the fashion these days. I know you've been digging through old land records. I know it because Frank Cully isn't capable of keeping his mouth shut about anything, and because half this county owes me enough that they tell me things whether I ask or not. Then you already know what we found, Gideon said. I know you found discrepancies, Blackridge said. Boundary lines that don't sit quite where the original surveys say they should. That's not uncommon in country like this. Land shifts, markers get disturbed, cattle wander, fences get rebuilt a few feet off where they used to stand. Nobody thinks twice about it for 30 years. 8 families, Evelyn said, all with the same discrepancy, all resolved in your favor, all gone within a year of the ruling. She watched his face carefully as she said it, looking for the flicker that would tell her how close to the truth she'd landed. That's not land shifting, Mr. Blackridge. That's a pattern. For a moment, nobody said anything. The wind moved through the yard, stirring the dust Blackridge's horse had kicked up coming in. You're a clever woman, Blackridge said finally, and there was no warmth in it at all now. I'll give you that. Clever enough to be dangerous if you're not careful. Clever enough that I think we should discuss what it would take to make this unpleasantness go away. There it is, Gideon said quietly. There what is? The offer. Gideon's voice had gone hard and flat. You didn't ride out here to deny anything. You rode out here to buy us off. Blackridge didn't bother denying that either. I rode out here because I think we're both reasonable men. And reasonable women, he added, with a glance at Evelyn that wasn't quite respectful, who understand that some fights aren't worth having. I'm prepared to forgive your note at the bank, clear it entirely. I'm prepared to see that boundary line redrawn in your favor, formally, with a new survey, so there's no question your property includes everything it should. You'd come out of this with more land and no debt. He looked between them. All you'd need to do is let this go. Stop asking questions. Stop visiting my wife. Let the past stay where it is. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Evelyn watched him, watched the muscles working in his jaw, and felt something close to fear. Not of Blackridge, but of the sheer size of the offer, the kind of relief it represented for a man who'd spent 6 years drowning slowly in debt and worry. A clear note. More land. No more lying awake counting days until February. It would have been so easy to take. What about the other 7 families? Gideon asked. Blackridge blinked, as if the question genuinely hadn't occurred to him as relevant. What about them? They don't get the same deal? Just us? They sold their land, Blackridge said. That's done. Finished business. This is about you and your situation, Gideon, not theirs. Their situation is the same as mine, Gideon said, except they didn't have a wife smart enough to find the fence post before it was too late. His voice had started low and was climbing now, the anger finally finding somewhere to go after weeks of being held down. You ruined 8 families in this valley. The Hutchins boy I went to school with, gone in the night like criminals when he was the one who got robbed. Old Pearson, dead of a weak heart less than a year after you took his land. And don't tell me that's a coincidence, because I don't believe in that many coincidences anymore. You're letting your imagination run ahead of the facts, Blackridge said, but something in his voice had thinned. I don't think I am. Gideon stepped forward until he was close enough that Blackridge had to either hold his ground or step back, and to his credit or his arrogance, Blackridge held his ground. I think you've been robbing this valley blind for 20 years and counting on every single person being too scared or too broke to do anything about it. And I think you came out here today because for the first time somebody finally found you out, and it's got you rattled enough to ride out here yourself instead of sending Otis Dunn to do your talking. The silence that followed had a different quality than the ones before it. Sharper, more dangerous. You should think very carefully, Blackridge said, his voice dropping low, all pretense of friendliness gone now, about what you're accusing me of, and what it will cost you to be wrong. I don't think I'm wrong. Then think about what it will cost you to be right. Blackridge's eyes moved to Evelyn, then back to Gideon. I own the banknote. I sit on the board that approves every loan in this county. I know the sheriff, the assessor, half the judges who'd ever hear a case like this. You have a notebook full of names and a few old papers, and you're going to stand in front of people who owe me everything and ask them to believe you over me? He put his hat back on, slow and deliberate. I came here today offering you a way out. You'd be wise to take it before I stop offering. We're not taking it, Evelyn said. Blackridge looked at her like he'd nearly forgotten she could speak without her husband's permission. I wasn't asking you. You should have been, Evelyn said. Since I'm the one who found the fence post and the survey records and your wife's box. The word landed in the yard like something physical. Blackridge's face didn't change immediately. That was the unsettling part, Evelyn thought later, the half second where a man like him could absorb a blow and not let it show. But his eyes did. Something moved behind them, fast and cold, doing math he hadn't expected to need to do today. What box? He said very quietly. I think you already know, Evelyn said. He looked at her for a long moment and then, without another word, he turned and walked off the porch, untied his horse, and rode away from the Mercer Ranch at a pace considerably faster than the one he'd arrived in. Gideon and Evelyn stood on the porch and watched him go until the dust settled behind him. You shouldn't have told him about the box, Gideon said finally. I know, Evelyn said, but I wanted him to understand exactly how badly he'd lost before he had time to plan around it. She wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. He's going to ride straight home and find Marion gone. We need to move fast before he has time to think clearly about what that means. They didn't sleep that night, not really. Evelyn spent it writing, letters, copies of the documents, a careful account of everything they'd found and how they'd found it, addressed not to the sheriff or the county judge, but to the state land office in the capital, 200 miles east, a body Blackridge had no leverage over and likely had never bothered to think about, because nobody had ever brought him a fight that reached that far before. Gideon spent the night doing the only thing he knew how to do with fear that had nowhere else to go. He checked the property line by lantern light, he made sure the animals were settled, he sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, not because he expected Blackridge to ride back that night with violence in mind, but because he couldn't make himself believe fully that he wouldn't. By morning they had a plan, rough as it was. Evelyn knew a name, an attorney out of Bozeman, a man named Walter Crane, no relation to Ida despite the shared name, who had a reputation, according to Earl Tabor, for taking cases nobody else in the valley would touch, precisely because he didn't depend on Blackridge for his living the way everyone else in Harlan Creek did. They drove to Bozeman themselves, 2 days hard travel, the wooden box wrapped and hidden beneath the wagon seat the entire way, Evelyn's notebook with its careful columns of names and dates kept close against her at all times, as if letting go of it for even a moment might be enough for it to disappear. Walter Crane was a thin, sharp-eyed man in his 50s, who read through everything they brought him without saying a word for nearly an hour, while Gideon sat across from him in a state of barely contained agitation, and Evelyn watched the lawyer's face the way she'd learned to watch faces. For the small things, the flickers, the moments where the careful composure cracked just enough to tell her something true. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed. This is more than a boundary dispute, Crane said. We know, Evelyn said. This is organized fraud. Surveyors paid to falsify records. A county assessor taking bribes to rule against legitimate landowners. A bank officer calling notes early to force distressed sales, probably on instruction. He tapped the ledger page Marion had copied. And if what you're telling me about Old Man Pearson is true, if there's any way to substantiate that his death came as a result of the stress and ruin your friend Blackridge caused him, that's a conversation for a different kind of court entirely. Can you take it to the state? Gideon asked. Bypass the county? I can, Crane said. And given what I'm looking at, I think we should. A state land office hearing with the Attorney General's office likely taking an interest given the scope of this. It'll take weeks to set in motion properly. Maybe longer. He looked at them both. And I'll tell you plainly, Blackridge isn't going to sit quietly while we do it. A man with his resources and his reach, when he's cornered, doesn't go down easy. He'll fight this with everything he has, and some of what he has won't look like lawyers. We understand that, Evelyn said. Do you? Crane studied them both for a long moment. Because I've seen men like Blackridge before, in other counties. They don't lose gracefully. They lose loudly, and they try to take as many people down with them as they can on the way. Gideon's hand found Evelyn's on the table between them, and he didn't let go of it for the rest of the meeting. God. The retaliation started within the week, faster than even Crane had predicted. It began with the bank. The note that had been due in February was suddenly called in early, the full amount demanded within 30 days, with a letter citing irregularities in the account history that Gideon had never once been late on. Then came the vandalism, fence posts torn out overnight along the south pasture, the very ones Evelyn had repaired herself weeks earlier, left scattered and broken in the dirt, like a message that didn't need words. A week after that, someone poisoned the water trough in the east field, and they lost 2 head of cattle before Gideon caught the smell and figured out what had happened. In town, the whispers that had once been about Evelyn's supposed past sharpened into something uglier and more organized. Handbills appeared nailed to the post outside the general store, accusing her without naming her directly but leaving no doubt who was meant, of stirring up false accusations against an honest businessman to cover for her own husband's debts. Ida Crane, who had cooled toward Evelyn weeks earlier, now crossed the street rather than walk past her. And then came the families. It started with one, a woman named Sarah Whitfield, whose family had lost their land 7 years before, and who showed up at the Mercer Ranch unannounced one evening, standing nervously on the porch with her hands knotted together, saying she'd heard, through the same gossip network that had spread the lies about Evelyn, that someone was finally looking into what had happened to families like hers. "I never told anyone the whole truth of it," Sarah said, sitting at the kitchen table that had become the unofficial center of everything happening in the valley. "We were ashamed. Folks figured we'd just failed, the way failed folks always get talked about. But the survey that took our north field, I kept a letter from the surveyor himself before he died. He wrote it to my father, half apologizing, saying he'd been told what lines to draw and didn't have a choice in the matter if he wanted to keep working in this county." She had brought the letter with her, worn soft from years of being folded and unfolded, read and reread by a family trying to decide what to do with a truth that had cost them everything once already. She wasn't the last to come. Within 2 weeks, 4 more families came forward, some with documents of their own, some with nothing but memory, and the simple relief of finally being able to say out loud what had happened to them, after years of swallowing it down because nobody had ever asked, because the story everyone told themselves was easier than the truth. Evelyn wrote it all down. Every name, every account, every scrap of evidence, building the case Walter Crane would eventually carry into a state hearing room 200 miles away. And somewhere in the middle of all that work, the long nights at the kitchen table, the fence repairs done together in silence that no longer felt like silence so much as understanding, the careful way Gideon had started reaching for her hand without thinking about it first, somewhere in all of that, the business arrangement that had begun on a stagecoach platform had quietly become something else entirely, something neither of them had named yet, but both of them now understood was real. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out. Blackridge, by every report reaching them through Earl Tabor and the few others in town brave enough to still talk to Evelyn, had not stopped fighting. If anything, the families coming forward seemed to have made him more dangerous, not less. A cornered man with money and reach and 20 years of practice making problems disappear, watching the one problem he couldn't simply buy or threaten away grow larger every single day. The 6 weeks before the hearing felt longer than the 6 years Gideon had spent alone on the ranch, before Evelyn ever stepped off that stagecoach. The bank's 30-day demand came and went, and Gideon couldn't pay it, not in full. And for 3 days he walked around the place like a man bracing for a blow he couldn't see coming, but knew was already in the air. Then Walter Crane sent word from Bozeman. A temporary injunction filed the same week the state land office agreed to open a formal inquiry, freezing any foreclosure action against properties named in an active fraud investigation. It wasn't a victory. It was a held breath. But a held breath was more than they'd had the week before, and Gideon learned those 6 weeks how much a person could live on when held breath was all that was offered. The vandalism stopped, oddly, once the injunction hit, as if Blackridge understood that open destruction now would only hand Crane more to work with in front of a state hearing. What replaced it was quieter, and in some ways worse, a slow draining away of the town's willingness to be seen near them. Walt Gruber still nodded at Gideon on the street, but he didn't stop to talk anymore. The store clerk who'd forgotten the seed order found other things to forget. Evelyn rode into town less, not because she'd lost her nerve, but because there was less and less reason to go. Fewer doors that opened to her. Fewer porches where anyone wanted to sit with the woman who'd dragged the valley's ugliest secret out into the light. It's like being quarantined, she said one evening, more tired than she usually let herself sound. Nobody's cruel to my face, they just disappear. That's its own kind of cruel, Gideon said. I know. She rubbed at her eyes. I think that's exactly why he's doing it that way. Loud cruelty gives people something to be angry about. Quiet cruelty just makes them tired enough to stop fighting on their own. He didn't have an answer for that, not a clean one, so he did the only thing he'd learned to do in the months since she arrived. He sat with her at the table and didn't leave until the numbers in front of her stopped looking quite so much like a losing battle. More families came forward in those weeks, slowly, one or two at a time, drawn out by the simple fact that the first ones hadn't been destroyed for speaking. Sarah Whitfield's letter from the dead surveyor became the cornerstone of Crane's case, but it wasn't alone for long. An old man named Joseph Alderman, 81 years old and living with his daughter in a town 40 miles east, sent a deposition by mail, his handwriting shaking but his account exact, describing the day the assessor had told his family, almost apologetically, that there was nothing more to be done and they should sell while the offer was still on the table. The Hutchins boy, not a boy anymore, a grown man with 2 children of his own in Idaho, wrote back when Crane's office reached him, agreeing to travel for the hearing if it would help, because, he wrote, I have spent 12 years telling my own children that we left because the land failed us, and I am tired of telling them a lie. Reading that line, Evelyn had to set the letter down and walk outside for a few minutes before she could finish going through the rest of the mail. You all right? Gideon asked, finding her by the paddock fence, the one she'd fixed with her own hands the first week she arrived, still standing straight and true, while half the rest of the valley's fences told lies nobody had bothered to question. I keep thinking about how easy it would have been for none of this to happen, she said. If you'd let me get back on that stage the first morning, if I'd been a different kind of woman, the kind who'd have taken the rejection and gone home without arguing. She looked at him. Joseph Alderman would still be telling himself it was bad luck. The Hutchins boy would still be lying to his own children. You don't get to take credit for being the only person willing to look, Gideon said. Other people could have looked. They just didn't. That's not comforting. Wasn't trying to comfort you, Gideon said. Just telling you the truth. Most folks see something wrong and decide it's safer not to know exactly how wrong it is. You're the first person who walked into this valley and refused to make that deal with yourself. He paused. That's not luck. That's just who you are. It was, she would think later, the closest thing to a love confession either of them had managed in the 8 weeks since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, and it had nothing flowery in it at all. Just a tired rancher, leaning on a fence post, telling a tired woman the plainest version of the truth he had. The hearing was held in the state capitol, in a room far larger and colder than anything Harlan Creek's little courthouse could have offered, with a panel of 3 land office commissioners, and seated at a separate table, a representative from the Attorney General's office, who had taken enough interest in Crane's filing to send someone in person. Blackridge arrived with 2 lawyers of his own, men in city suits who looked entirely unbothered by the proceedings. The particular unbotheredness of men who had been paid enough to project confidence regardless of what they privately believed about their chances. Blackridge himself looked older than Evelyn remembered from the one time she'd seen him outside the records office. The weeks of fighting a battle he couldn't simply buy his way out of had worn something down in him that money hadn't been able to replace. The hearing ran 2 full days. Crane laid the case out methodically. The original survey markers, the moved fence posts, the pattern across 8 properties, the assessor's letters, the bank officer who'd been quietly relocated to Bozeman with a standard of living that didn't match a clerk's salary, Marion Blackridge's ledger pages laid alongside the official county records to show, line by line, where the truth and the paperwork had been pulled apart from each other. Then came the families. Sarah Whitfield spoke first, her voice shaking at the start and steadying as she went, reading the dead surveyor's letter into the record. Joseph Alderman's deposition was read aloud by Crane's assistant, since the old man hadn't been well enough to travel, and the room went very quiet at the line where he described his wife crying in the wagon as they drove away from the only home she'd ever known. The Hutchins man stood and told the commissioners plainly that he had spent 12 years lying to his own children about why his family had run in the night, and that he was done lying. Blackridge's lawyers objected where they could, picked at small inconsistencies in dates, tried to suggest that grief and resentment had colored memories that were decades old. It didn't matter. The documents didn't have memories to color. The documents simply said what they said, and what they said, laid end to end across 8 families in 20 years, left almost nothing for 2 city lawyers in good suits to stand on. It was on the second afternoon during a recess that Blackridge found a moment alone with Evelyn in the hallway outside the hearing room. The kind of moment a desperate man manufactures because he has run out of other strategies. "You've destroyed me," he said, without preamble. "You understand that. Whatever this commission decides, my name in this valley is finished." "You destroyed yourself," Evelyn said. 20 years before I ever stepped off that stagecoach. "I gave that county everything," Blackridge said, and there was something almost wounded in it, the particular self-pity of a man who has never once examined what he actually did to the people around him. Roads, jobs, a bank that kept half those families afloat in years they'd have gone under without it. "You gave them just enough to keep them dependent," Evelyn said, "and then you took everything else when it suited you." "That's not generosity, Mr. Blackridge. That's just theft with better manners." He looked at her for a long moment, and whatever he'd hoped to find in her face, guilt, maybe, or the kind of doubt a smaller person might have shown when confronted with the size of the wreckage, wasn't there. She simply looked tired, and certain, and unmoved. "You'll regret this," he said, weaker than he probably meant it to sound. "I don't think I will," Evelyn said, and walked back into the hearing room. The ruling, when it came 3 weeks later by mail, was as complete as Crane had dared to hope. Every fraudulent boundary line was ordered redrawn according to the original surveys. The Mercer property, along with 7 others, had its rightful acreage restored, water rights included. The county assessor's office was placed under state oversight, pending a full review of every ruling Thomas Greer had ever signed. Criminal referrals were sent forward against Greer himself, against the bank officer now comfortably settled in Bozeman, and against Silas Blackridge for conspiracy to defraud, charges serious enough that his lawyers spent the following months negotiating what would eventually become a settlement. Most of his land liquidated, the proceeds split as restitution among the 8 families he'd ruined, and a county he could no longer set foot in without being recognized as exactly what he was. He didn't go to prison. The state's case, strong as it was, ran up against the limits of what could be proven beyond doubt in a court rather than a land commission, and his lawyers found enough room in that gap to keep him from a cell. But he lost the only thing that had ever truly mattered to him, which was the particular total power of being the man nobody in Harlan Creek could afford to cross. He left the valley quietly, the way Marion had 2 months before him, except nobody waited up wondering if he'd find his footing again somewhere else. Nobody much cared what happened to him at all. Marion, for her part, wrote to Evelyn once more after it was over, a short letter, sent from Helena, saying simply that she had taken work as a seamstress, that her cousin's household had welcomed her without question, and that for the first time in 19 years, she slept without listening for the sound of a particular pair of boots in the hallway. "I don't know if what I did made up for the years I said nothing," she wrote, "but it is the truest thing I have ever done, and I find I would rather be poor and honest than comfortable and complicit. Thank you for giving an old, frightened woman the chance to finally be brave." Evelyn read that letter twice and then put it away in the same satchel that had once carried Marion's wooden box across the county, because some things deserved to be kept close even after the danger that made them necessary had passed. The 8 families got their land back, though not all of them chose to return to it. The Aldermans had built a new life in their new county and decided, after everything, that going back would mean reopening wounds that had only just begun to close. The state's restitution money let old Joseph live out his last years in comfort instead, which his daughter said was its own kind of justice. The Hutchins man came back to Harlan Creek just once, to stand on the land that had been his family's, and was now legally his again, and then sold it to a young couple just starting out, because he said his life and his children were in Idaho now, and a piece of paper correcting an old wrong didn't have to mean dragging everyone backward to make it right. Sarah Whitfield rebuilt on her family's restored acreage and became, within a year, the kind of neighbor who showed up with food when someone's barn burned and stayed to help rebuild it, the way the valley used to be before Blackridge had taught everyone to keep their heads down and mind their own. The valley itself changed slowly, the way places do, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the accumulation of small things. People started talking to each other again without checking first who might overhear. The new county assessor, appointed under state oversight, ran his office with a transparency that made Frank Cully's old methods look like exactly what they'd always been. Ida Crane, of all people, came by the Mercer Ranch one afternoon nearly a year later with a pie, and an apology she didn't quite manage to say out loud, though the pie said most of it for her, and Evelyn let her stay for coffee, because holding a grudge against a frightened, gossiping woman who'd eventually found her conscience seemed like a waste of the peace they'd all fought so hard to get. As for the ranch itself, the fence line ran true now, all the way around, every post exactly where the original survey said it should be, and the creek that fed the south pasture ran a little fuller once the water rights were properly restored, enough that Gideon stopped waking at 4 a.m. to stare at the ceiling and do anxious math about drought. He still worked harder than most men his age. That part of him hadn't changed and never would, but there was a difference now in how he carried it. Not the grim, solitary stubbornness of a man holding a sinking thing together by sheer refusal to let go, but the steadier work of someone building something with another person who'd decided, fully and without reservation, to build it with him. "You know," he said to her one evening, the two of them sitting on the porch steps watching the last light go gold and then gray over the hills, "I almost sent you back, that first morning." "I remember," Evelyn said. "You were very clear about it. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you'd just turned around and gotten back on that stage." "I thought about it," she admitted, "for about half a second. Then I decided I hadn't traveled 2 days on a bad road to be told no by a man who hadn't even asked me a single question." He laughed, low and easy, the sound of a man who'd learned, slowly and against every instinct he'd built over 6 lonely years, how to let himself be happy without immediately bracing for it to be taken away. "Good thing you're stubborn," he said. "Good thing you eventually came around," she said. She leaned her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and out past the porch the ranch sat quiet in the dusk. The mended fences, the full water trough, the barn roof patched properly this time with the right materials. The whole worn, hard-won shape of a life two people had decided, against every reasonable expectation either of them started with, to build together. It hadn't been romance that brought them to this porch. It had been a business arrangement between a frightened, proud man and a woman who'd run out of room to be herself anywhere else. But somewhere between a moved fence post and a wooden box of stolen secrets, between 8 ruined families finding their voice and a frightened wife finally finding her nerve, something real had grown up in the space where the arrangement used to be. Not because either of them had gone looking for it, but because they had chosen, every single day of that long, dangerous fight, to be honest with each other when it would have been so much easier to lie. That, in the end, was the whole of what the Valley learned from Gideon Mercer and Evelyn Cross. That the truth costs something almost everyone is tempted to avoid paying, that silence protects the people doing harm far more often than it protects the people staying quiet, and that courage rarely looks like a single dramatic moment. More often, it looks like a woman picking up her own bag and walking toward a ranch nobody wanted her to reach, one stubborn, unglamorous day at a time, until the whole crooked thing she walked into finally stood up straight.